So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got almost 40 clips on a few different topics for what I think should be a great show tonight. As always, this is my weekly broadcast of the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with a little political comedy and along with my commentary between the clips. And as usual, I'll be using clips from the Sunday morning news shows on the regular Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, and I'll also have a few of those quasi-news political comedy clips from Friday night's Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. I'll be showing some quick clips at the end on 2016 presidential politics, media, and even immigration, as I've listed down in the video description, though most of the clips will be on the ongoing conflict in Iraq. But first, I want to start with a perennial topic on my show, the split in the Republican Party, which was actually exacerbated this week by events in Iraq because one of the old leaders of the neocon wing of the Republican Party, Dick Cheney, was back in the news criticizing the current president for being wrong on Iraq, which Bill Maher satirized in his monologue on HBO last Friday, like this.
Yeah, Dick Cheney, boy, what a pair of balls on him. He said this week that rarely has a president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. And in Texas, George Bush went, "Stop, you're embarrassing me."
But actually, it wasn't George Bush who Dick Cheney really seemed to embarrass this week. It was that other part of the Republican Party, Fox News, where last Wednesday, Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly actually confronted Dick Cheney, at least somewhat confronted him, I think, on that exact same line in his opinion article about President Obama being wrong on Iraq, which I'll discuss a little more after I show this rare Fox News confrontational moment with Dick Cheney, and also look at Dick Cheney's answer. I'll show the whole thing in full. It's like 2.5 minutes. I like the way it begins with his gaffe that I think shows Republicans always go to Ronald Reagan when they think they're in trouble, as you'll see after Megyn Kelly asks a pretty confrontational question over in this clip.
In your op-ed, you write as follows: "Rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. But time and time again, history has proven that you got it wrong as well in Iraq, sir. You said there was no doubt Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. You said we would be greeted as liberators. You said the Iraq insurgency was in the last throes back in 2005. And you said that after our intervention, extremists would have to, quote, rethink their strategy of jihad. Now, with almost $1 trillion spent there, with 4,500 American lives lost there, what do you say to those who say you were so wrong about so much at the expense of so many?"
No, I just fundamentally disagree, Megyn. You've got to go back and look at the track record. We inherited a situation where there was no doubt in anybody's mind about the extent of Saddam's involvement in weapons of mass destruction. We had a situation where after 9/11, we were concerned about a follow-on attack that would involve not just airline tickets and box cutters as the weapons, but rather something far deadlier, perhaps even a nuclear weapon. Saddam Hussein had a track record that nearly everybody agreed to. We had an overwhelming vote of approval from the Congress, more votes for the action than we'd had in Desert Storm some 10 years before. Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, numerous others spoke to the difficulties of the intelligence that all of us saw with respect to the threat that Saddam Hussein represented. It would have been irresponsible for us not to act. We did do the right thing, and I think the troops performed magnificently, and now we're in a situation where what Liz and I posted in our op-ed this morning is it's not just Iraq, but it's a whole pattern of behavior over the last 6 years that has refused to recognize that there is a war on terror, that we've got to move very aggressively to be able to deal with that, and this administration has repeatedly demonstrated that they don't believe it. Barack Obama has stated repeatedly the terrorist threat's gone. We got bin Laden. That's clearly not the case. That's not the truth. And in fact, we have a situation tonight where terrorism is potentially in charge of a larger part of the Middle East than ever before in our history.
I can't believe I still have to listen to that guy. And Megyn Kelly and Fox News weren't the only Republicans who weren't going along with Dick Cheney this week. Rand Paul, who's one of the main leaders of what some call the non-interventionists and others call the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, was over on Meet the Press, as well as another show. But I'm going to show a clip of him on Meet the Press where he specifically distinguished himself from Dick Cheney at the prodding of Meet the Press host David Gregory over in this clip.
Former Vice President Dick Cheney has been quite critical of this president. He wrote an op-ed this week in which he said, in part, "Rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. Too many times to count, Mr. Obama has told us he is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as though wishing makes it so." Do you think Dick Cheney is a credible critic of this president?
I think the same questions could be asked of those who supported the Iraq war. You know, were they right in their predictions? Were there weapons of mass destruction there? That's what the war was sold on. Was democracy easily achievable? Was the war won in 2005 when many of these people said it was won? They didn't really, I think, understand the civil war that would break out. And what's going on now, I don't blame on President Obama. Has he really got the solution? Maybe there is no solution. But I do blame the Iraq war on the chaos that is in the Middle East. I also blame those who are for the Iraq war for emboldening Iran. These are the same people now who are petrified of what Iran may become, and I understand some of their worry.
You're not a Dick Cheney Republican when it comes to American power in the Middle East.
What I would say is that the war emboldened Iran. Iran is much more of a threat because of the Iraq war than they were before. Before there was a standoff between Sunnis and Shiites. Now there is Iranian hegemony throughout the region.
So, yeah, there's definitely a split in the Republican Party between Rand Paul and Dick Cheney. And I thought it was even more interesting. David Gregory asked Rand Paul to say that the world was less safe because of President Obama, and he wouldn't even go that far. And in some ways, he seemed almost to move himself to the left of President Obama. And I'll discuss that a little later when I show a clip from Real Time with Bill Maher, kind of an extended clip on that, on the split in the Republican Party. But first, here's Rand Paul refusing to say, Dick Cheney in his op-ed was saying, Obama's destroying the world. Here's Rand Paul refusing to say that Obama's made the world less safe over in this clip.
President Obama made America less safe and less respected in that part of the world.
Yeah, I don't think I would put it that way. I disagree with the president I disagree with him on the Libyan incursion and with arming the Syrian rebels. With ending the war in Iraq, I've been trying to end it for years. In fact, one of the important constitutional questions here is what authority does anyone have to go to war in Iraq? I've been trying to take that authority away. I introduced a vote in the Senate about a year or two ago, and we only got about 33, 34 votes to end the war, even though it's over. But here's my point is that can one generation bind another generation? Can the people you elected in 2002 who voted to go to war in 2002, does that bind us forever? Are we at war forever? No geographic limit and no temporal or time limit on this? I think there has to be a limit, and that if we go to war again, and I'm not saying we never go to war, that's why I've even said I don't rule out airstrikes, but if we're going to go to war, there needs to be a vote of the American people through their representatives. We need to have a consensus that yes, it is worth dying to regain Mosul, even though the Shiites and the people who live there are not willing to fight for it.
You have blamed...
So yeah, I'm actually going to show a previous clip from that interview of Rand Paul earlier where he talks about being willing to die for Mosul. But I'm showing this kind of out of order because this is more about the split in the Republican Party. And I thought that was interesting that Senator Rand Paul, a probable presidential candidate who's leading this non-interventionist / isolationist wing of the Republican Party, wouldn't say that Obama's made America less safe. And in some ways, he seemed to move to the left of the president, saying that Congress has to authorize more, and being more of a strict constitutionalist libertarian, I guess maybe. And in some ways, I think he's also positioning himself to be to the left of Hillary Clinton, which I'll discuss a little more after I show a couple more clips about the split in the Republican Party. And I don't want to leave the impression that nobody's on Dick Cheney's side or on the interventionist, non-isolationist, whatever you want to call it, wing of the Republican Party. Adam Kinzinger was over on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and Jonathon Karl showed him a clip of Dick Cheney and a clip of Rand Paul, and I thought it was kind of funny. One thing, Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican, wouldn't actually say he was on Dick Cheney's side. He wouldn't say he was a Dick Cheney Republican, but he said he's a defense Republican. So I guess the name Dick Cheney doesn't have a lot of value even on the side of the Republican Party where people agree with him, as you can see over in this clip.
Some in my party have distorted this belief in peace through strength into a misguided belief that we should project strength through war. Even when we've tried through good intentions to make the world a better place, our actions have often backfired.
Rand Paul, and by my standards, as I look at his philosophy, is basically an isolationist.
Senator Rand Paul plus former Vice President Dick Cheney just moments ago. The roundtable is here now. Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison, Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger, ABC's chief foreign correspondent Terry Moran, who is just back from Iraq, and Greta Van Susteren from Fox News. So, Congressman Kinzinger, I want to ask you, Republican, are you a Cheney Republican or a Rand Paul Republican when it comes
I'm a
to
defense
policy?
Republican. Look, I don't agree with Rand on a lot of his foreign policy positions. I think a few years ago he put out a budget proposal that cut our military in half, which is something very frightening to me as a military guy myself, and I know that this is a significant thing. So I would consider myself a defense Republican.
Some say he's the front runner for the nomination.
No, I don't think he is. I mean, look, he represents a very important part of our party, kind of that libertarian viewpoint. But there's a lot of different parts of our party. And one of the things that's made us very strong, and I think is our defining issue, is the fact that we understand that a strong United States of America stops things like a Russian incursion, stops things like global terrorism, and fills a vacuum that would otherwise be filled by bad actors.
So yeah, you can see that there are Republicans who are on Dick Cheney's side, even if they aren't willing to actually identify themselves with the name Dick Cheney. Although Adam Kinzinger, he is an Iraq war veteran, so that gives him some status in the Republican Party as a spokesperson. But I don't see him running for president. But there was a split on this issue in the Republican Party between Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, both of whom might be running for president. And I want to show, the next clip is a clip of Candy Crowley also interviewed Rand Paul. That was the other show. Candy Crowley on CNN's State of the Union interviewed Rand Paul and showed him a clip of Marco Rubio disagreeing with him on airstrikes to deal with the situation in Iraq. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
The reason why we care is because we cannot allow a safe haven to develop there that can be used to carry out attacks that can kill Americans, including here in our homeland.
So do you believe that the ISIS is a national security threat to the United States?
Well, do you know where the safe haven is? The safe haven's in Syria. So those who have been, let me finish. Because the thing is that they would not be empowered in Iraq if we were not providing safe haven in Syria by arming their allies.
So should we go to Syria? I mean, the thing is we kind of are where we are.
No,
so
well, we are where we are because we are where we are because we armed the Syrian rebels. We have been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, fighting alongside ISIS. ISIS is now emboldened in 2 countries. But here's the anomaly. We're with ISIS in Syria. We're on the same side of the war. So those who want to get involved to stop ISIS in Iraq are allied with ISIS in Syria. That is the real contradiction to this whole policy.
Right.
So, I do actually agree with some of what Rand Paul says and about the contradiction in policy. That's definitely true. And it wasn't just Rand Paul responding to Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio was actually interviewed over on CBS's Face the Nation. Bob Schieffer was off, Norah O'Donnell was in, and she kind of confronted Senator Marco Rubio with what Senator Rand Paul had said. And so this is kind of the other side of that same split that you can see over in this clip.
Rand Paul wrote in the Wall Street Journal, kind of raised the question, what would airstrikes accomplish? That in essence, we would become Iran's Air Force by aiding them. Your take?
Well, I don't agree with that statement. I think that's quite an exaggeration. The truth of the matter is that if we do nothing, Iran is still going to be involved. And in fact, if you think about it, imagine if Iran goes in there, becomes involved, and somehow helps the Iraqis turn back ISIS. You can rest assured that a future Iraqi government will be completely, 100% under the influence and in the pocket of Iran. They will have expanded their strategic reach to include practical control, not just over Syria, if Assad survives, but also over Iraq, increasingly positioning themselves as a hegemonic power. The United States has a different hope for Iraq's future. It belongs to them as to how they get there, but our hope is a country that includes Kurds and Sunni and Shia and even Christians, an inclusive country for its future. That is not Iran's goal here. To do nothing and allow ISIS to establish a base of operation like what al-Qaeda had before Afghanistan places us in a very dangerous position from a counterterrorism point of view and puts Americans' lives on the line down the road.
So you can see there Marco Rubio and Rand Paul have a big disagreement on the importance of U.S. military intervention in the Iraq crisis and also on Syria. And I'll get more to the Syria issue later when I do the clips that are more fully on the Iraq situation. But before I leave the issue of the split in the Republican Party, of course, that split isn't just over interventionism or isolationism or whatever you want to call it. One of the topics I covered on last Sunday's show was Eric Cantor, the Senate, or not the Senate, the House Republican Majority Leader, the number 2 Republican in the House of Representatives, lost in a primary to a Tea Party challenger. Well, this last week, the Republicans in the House of Representatives held their elections, and they elected a new Republican Majority Leader, and that's the number 2 person to the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and the person they elected is a Republican congressman from California, Kevin McCarthy, and he was over on Fox News Sunday. Other Sunday shows covered the split in the Republican Party. Over on Fox News Sunday, they actually emphasized the new leadership in the Republican Party, and I'll show a clip about the intro to Fox News Sunday later in the show. But here is Kevin McCarthy talking about whether he is actually more conservative or less conservative than Eric Cantor. He's actually gotten some criticism from the same Tea Party people who were responsible for Eric Cantor losing, saying that Kevin McCarthy, the California Republican, is also a Washington insider. And here's Chris Wallace confronting him with that split in the Republican Party that you can see here.
But some Tea Party advocates, activists are concerned. Richard Viguerie, a longtime conservative activist, said you and Steve Scalise, the new House Whip, the man who replaced you in the number 3 job, are, quote, business as usual, go along to get along, Washington insiders. The gap between the leadership of the Republican Party and the base of the party continues to widen. How do you plead?
Well, I think he probably doesn't know my background. I'm a conservative. I believe in the idea of freedom and liberty, but more importantly, look at my voting background. I voted against bailing out Wall Street. I voted against, never voted for a tax increase. I come through the grassroots. My family was not Republicans. I'm the youngest. I came to this party based upon choice. I believe the Constitution matters, that it's not just a few pieces of paper.
But
I always love it when Republicans say that they're pro-choice with no sense of irony. But I also want to show one more clip of Republican Kevin McCarthy. This is Fox News anchor Chris Wallace confronting him with another measure that he may actually be less conservative than Eric Cantor, the guy who lost in the Tea Party to a Tea Party challenger in the primary, and who he's replacing as, has been elected by other members of the House, Republican members of the House of Representatives, as the number 2 official in the House of Representatives. And so here's that second confrontation about whether he's conservative enough here.
Seen as less conservative than the man you're replacing, Eric Cantor. And let me put a couple of numbers up on the screen. The Club for Growth ranked Cantor with a 68% conservative voting record, you at 53%. National Journal says Cantor was the 80th most conservative House member, You were 170th. They base this on votes on various issues. Your response?
And American Conservative Union gives me a lifetime rating of 90. Faith and Freedom gives me 100%. Who rates what conservative? Check my voting record, check what I believe, and look what I've done. From the standpoint is, when they wanted to bail out Wall Street, I said no twice. When they wanted to raise taxes, I've always said no. I have a philosophical belief that this Constitution matters.
Well, let's.
So yeah, back to the Constitution again. He seems to have some good talking points there, and I don't know exactly how informative that little confrontation between Fox News and the new Republican majority leader in the House of Representatives was, but I actually found a discussion over on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher more informative about the split in the Republican Party, and they were actually mostly talking about the interventionist versus the non-interventionist wing. And it includes Bill Maher talking, and Glenn Greenwald is on. You can see I actually have Glenn Greenwald's new book is the new book in the place where you can see the title up there, the No Place to Hide. I just got that this week, and I'll talk about that a little more maybe later. But first I want to show this discussion. It had Glenn Greenwald, Bill Maher, and then this Republican strategist, her name is Kristen Soltis Anderson, and they talk about the split in the Republican Party and the confrontation between Megyn Kelly and Dick Cheney. That's kind of what set it off, as you can see over in this clip.
Dick Cheney said that comment about, Obama did everything wrong, and she said, wait a second, all your predictions were wrong. You said we would be greeted as liberators. You said, we were in the last throes of the insurgency in 2005. All this stuff he got wrong. I think this is kind of reading the tea leaves in the Republican Party. Dick Cheney is the past, and maybe they know that at Fox News. And maybe Rand Paul, who doesn't want to be an interventionist, maybe that's the future. Is that what's going on here?
In a post-Bush era, there is no such thing as a unified Republican foreign policy position. There is a whole spectrum, and in particular, now that Republicans don't have the White House, and the folks like Rand Paul can have a large faction within the party. I mean, that's where public opinion is really headed, especially among young people. When you ask young people if they would like to see a larger military, a smaller military, about the same size, they tend to say, is this really the best expenditure of our money to go fight a bunch of wars overseas? And so the burden of proof is going to be a lot higher for folks in the future who do want to send troops overseas, because a new generation of voters is very, very, very skeptical.
I think there's an interesting division going on in the Republican Party, too, on the right that doesn't get a lot of attention. We like to mock them as monolithic, but there's a huge part of the Republican Party that is non-interventionist. The person who just beat Eric Cantor, Dave Bratt, ran against the NSA. He ran against interventionism. He ran against Wall Street, this kind of more traditional conservatism, paleo-conservatism, isolationism, whatever you want to call it, that I think Fox News is starting to realize is out there and channeling. And there was an article in the New York Times about the resurgence of neocons, the Kagans and all these people all over TV. And what they said was that these neocons actually looked to Hillary Clinton, who's a hardcore hawk and interventionist, as their future kind of vessel for military aggression in the way that they think the Republican Party is starting to abandon them. And I think when you see Fox News going hard after Dick Cheney, and the next day she did it to John Bolton, it's reflecting this interesting division on the right about a lot of these issues.
I mean,
So yeah, I thought that was actually one of the best discussions of the split in the Republican Party and the way it's been exacerbated by the events in Iraq this last week. And it wasn't on one of the Big Five Sunday morning news shows. It was on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher and Glenn Greenwald. And that's actually a topic I've discussed a couple times in LiberalViewer Sunday live clip roundups in the past, about whether Hillary Clinton may end up on the right of the Republican nominee if it turns out to be Rand Paul. And I actually don't think it's going to be Rand Paul, but I can't say that for certain. It depends on a lot of factors and things that haven't happened yet. But I mean, that would be a really interesting matchup, and it might actually put the Republicans on the left of the Democrats on foreign policy in a lot of ways, just like Glenn Greenwald was saying there. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, even if it's not really a likely matchup after the primaries, because I don't think Rand Paul can actually get the nomination, although he is doing a lot of things that are kind of surprising, as I'll discuss a little later. But having shown the split in the Republican Party and how it was exacerbated by the events in Iraq, I actually want to get to the events in Iraq, and I have a whole bunch of clips on that to show you tonight. First, Dick Cheney wasn't just a player in the split, with that interview with Megyn Kelly. He was actually on one of the Sunday morning news shows this morning, ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where he gave an interview, and the first question they asked him, and I don't know why people ask him. Oh no, sorry. The first clip I'm going to show is this is Jonathon Karl actually confronting Dick Cheney with his wrongness, just like Megyn Kelly did. And you can see Dick Cheney has prepared a slightly better response, but pretty much the same kind of evasion that doesn't really answer the basic question about his wrongness. And I'll discuss that a little more after you see Jonathon Karl actually not only bring up his Dick Cheney's past wrongness, but show clips, actual video clips of him being wrong to him, and to get his response, which is always fun to see. And I'll talk about that a little more after you see it here.
You wrote in your op-ed, rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. But a lot of your critics, left and right, say that you are the one that has over and over again been wrong on Iraq, and they point to statements like these.
Regime change in Iraq would bring about a number of benefits to the region.
We will, in fact, be greeted as liberators. I think they're in the last throes, if you will, of the insurgency.
Now, Rand Paul, pointing to things like that, wrote in the Wall Street Journal also, many of those clamoring for military action now are the same people who made every false assumption imaginable about the cost, challenge, and purpose of the Iraq war. They have been wrong for so long. Why should we listen to them again? Your response?
With all due respect, John, I was a strong supporter then of going into Iraq. I'm a strong supporter now. Everybody knows what my position is. There's nothing to be argued about there. But if we spend our time debating what happened 11 or 12 years ago, we're going to miss the threat that is growing and that we do face. Rand Paul, with all due respect, is basically an isolationist. He doesn't believe we ought to be involved in that part of the world. I think it's absolutely essential. One of the things I worried about 12 years ago and that I worry about today is that there will be another 9/11 attack, and that the next time it'll be with weapons far deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters. And when we have a situation developing in Pakistan, for example, where there are nuclear weapons, where supposedly that technology has been sold to the North Koreans, at the same time the president announces a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan right next door, that we're missing the boat. We don't understand the nature of the threat, and we're unwilling to deal with it.
No, I don't know. Did that answer satisfy you? You let me know what you think down in the comment section, but neither time did Dick Cheney's answer really satisfy me. It was like, 9/11, big threat, not recognized, Obama's fault, this is not my fault, or I don't know. You tell me but what you think, but I don't think it was a really satisfactory answer. And one of the big controversies, and I'm not going to show a clip from CNN's reliable sources, but they were talking about the controversy about why it is that people who were so wrong on Iraq before are being asked now their opinion on Iraq. Why are they back in the media at all? And even though you can see that Jonathon Karl of ABC asked that confrontational question, and Megyn Kelly also asked a confrontational question, they both also asked Dick Cheney his opinion on what to do now. And here's Jonathon. I'm not going to show the Megyn Kelly clip, but here's Jonathon Karl asking Dick Cheney what to do now and not really getting an answer, as you can see over in this clip.
You made a big splash this week with an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal under the headline, "The Collapsing Obama Doctrine." Some very harsh criticism of the president. But what I didn't read in your op-ed is, what is your solution, your plan right now for Iraq? What would you be doing?
Well, first of all, John, I'd recognize that Iraq is not the whole problem. We've got a much bigger problem than just the current crisis in Iraq. The Rand Corporation was out within the last week with a report that showed that there's been a 58% increase in the number of groups like Al-Qaeda Salafi jihadist, and it stretches from West Africa, all across North Africa, East Africa, through the Middle East, all the way around to Indonesia, a doubling of the number of terrorists out there. The first thing we have to do is recognize we've got a hell of a problem, and it's not just in Iraq. I worry about Pakistan. Just a couple of weeks ago in Pakistan, the Taliban, the same group that we just released 5 of the leaders of from Guantanamo, Taliban raided Karachi airport. Why do I care about that? Well, Pakistan's unique in that it has a significant inventory of nuclear weapons. We have evidence that the man who built the Pakistani program, A.Q. Khan, offered up recently, and that was that the North Koreans had bribed Pakistani officials for sophisticated technology for enriching uranium, and that the North Koreans now have some 2,000 centrifuges operating to enrich uranium. We had North Korea try to provide Syria with a nuclear reactor. The difficulty, the spread of the terrorist organizations is not recognized by the administration. The proliferation of nuclear capability and the possibility that it could fall into the hands of terrorists is not really being addressed at all. And I appreciate the problems we've got in Iraq right now. But what I think we need is a broad strategy that lets us address this whole range of issues, and that involves reversing a number of the policies of the Obama administration.
But let me ask you just specifically on Iraq, 'cause that's the crisis confronting us right at this moment. Would you take airstrikes against ISIS? Would you move special forces into Iraq? What would you do in Iraq?
Well, what we should have done in Iraq was
what would you do now?
Behind a force. Well, what I would do now, John, is, among other things, be realistic about the nature of the threat. When we're
So yeah, I'm not going to show all the rest of it. He never answered that question, really. The closest, what we should do now is recognize the nature of the threat. That's not really, and he kept trying to say it was because of what Obama did and by trying to rewrite history there, because a lot of that wasn't accurate. And I thought it was kind of interesting. One of the Democrats who was on the shows this morning, Representative Keith Ellison, I think he's still the only Muslim American in the U.S. Congress. He was over on ABC, and after that whole Dick Cheney interview, he pointed out that Dick Cheney didn't answer that question, and he also thought that it was ridiculous that anyone was even asking him his opinion, as you can see over. Let me make sure I get the right clip here. Is it number? Yeah, as you can see over in this clip.
So, Congressman, what was your take on Cheney?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, why don't we go get the guy who wrecked the XL Mondees and ask him about, how to run an oil tanker? I mean, there couldn't be a worse person to offer views on what to do next. And by the way, he didn't offer views on what to do next. There is one very slight sliver that I think Cheney had something going, and that is broadening this thing. But I think diplomatically we've got to widen it. We've got to get the Gulf countries, and I believe Iran, in some sort of a conversation about how to pull their proxies back, which I think is the key to this thing. Personally, I think if we just go using military power right off the bat, there is
Are you okay with what the president's ordered now, sending over those 300 or up to 300 special operators?
I don't know what they're going to do. If I knew more about it, I might be for it. But at this point, it's just weird. I just don't get it. But my point is, here's the real thing. Without the diplomatic engagement, if you use military power, you run the risk of driving ISIS and the Sunni population together. Our goal should be to separate them, to isolate ISIS. And to do that, you've got to have those Gulf countries, and you've got to say, understanding that the Sunni population is somehow going to be cut into government, somehow going to have a role.
And Terry,
Well, I definitely agree with what Representative Keith Ellison was saying there at the end about the Gulf countries, and I've even said that we need to set up a regional conference and maybe even redraw the map. And I liked the way that he started his comment there, comparing talking to Dick Cheney about Iraq with talking to the captain of the Exxon Valdez about keeping your oil safe or something like that. Although I noticed he also wouldn't say whether he was for or against these 300 military advisors that President Obama has sent to Iraq. And I'm going to show another person who represents the more left wing of the Democratic Party, like Keith Ellison does, Barbara Boxer, a senator from my state of California. I'll also be showing Dianne Feinstein, who I wouldn't say represents the left wing of the Democratic Party. I'm not even sure she represents the right wing of the Democratic Party, but Barbara Boxer's left wing of the Republican Party and left wing of the Democratic Party. And she was commenting first as Keith Ellison was on Dick Cheney's op-ed and why anyone would be asking his opinion, and she used some strong words against Dick Cheney, as you can see over in this clip.
Mm-hmm. And Vice President Cheney said this week, rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many.
That is sick when you really look back at the record. It was Vice President Cheney and Condi Rice working for George W. Bush and Rumsfeld and all those folks. It's just like, you know, a nightmare come back to haunt me, just frankly, who were basically telling us, get right back in there again. The American people don't want it, the president doesn't want us, and the saner voices in the Senate and House don't want it. We do have a national security interest in preventing another 9/11. The Iraqis had their chance. They blew it, and I think right now they've got to figure out if they can form an inclusive government.
So yeah, that's the left wing of the Democratic Party. The Iraqis had their chance and they blew it, and she was criticizing Dick Cheney, and like Keith Ellison, she also wouldn't really come out strongly in favor of these 300 military advisors. When Norah O'Donnell over on Face the Nation asked Senator Barbara Boxer about whether she supported these 300 military advisors, she went back to some talking points about blaming George W. Bush, which of course I agree with, but didn't really answer the question, as you can see over in this clip.
300 military advisors going to be enough?
Oh, listen, I agree with the president. We're not going to go back into that war again, ever. The fact is, what we're seeing now is an outgrowth of that bad policy the neocons got us in, that crowd on false pretense that said, go in there. And as a result, ISIS was born. Let's face that fact. And then in 2007, when Vice President Biden, then Senator Biden, and I was on the Foreign Relations Committee, he was my chairman, suggested we have 3 semi-autonomous regions, the Bush administration and the neocons said, absolutely not, even though we had more than 70 votes for that. So as a result, we have Maliki, who hasn't included the Sunnis. ISIS moved in to fill the void. So let's be clear on this. And now they're turning it into kind of a religious civil war. So as far as I'm concerned, the advisors there, as far as I know, are there to really give an assessment of what's happening on the ground. That's very important for us. And also they have a counterterrorism mission, which I voted for after 9/11. We need to go after the terrorists who are a threat to us.
So I guess that is somewhat of an endorsement of the 300 advisors that President Obama sent to Iraq from Barbara Boxer, but she did at the beginning there sort of changed the subject, but she sort of in her own way limited their mission, because who knows exactly what it is they're doing and how much they're going to be involved in actual operations. And some people say that they're there to set up the targets for airstrikes, although that isn't definite, and I'm not sure if that's true or not. But I thought it was interesting that Barbara Boxer didn't come out strongly in favor of that, as showing the left wing of the Democratic Party, and then Rand Paul, showing the left wing of the Republican Party, wouldn't completely criticize President Obama for sending the 300 advisors in his interview over on Meet the Press. And I'll talk about that a little more after you see that clip here.
The president who says, like you do, look, the Iraqis should stand up and fight them, but he also wants to send 300 advisors there to help out.
I don't question the 300 advisors for this reason. I'm not sure exactly where they're going or what they're doing. I do think that we have an embassy there, and we've got 1,000, 2,000 people there, that yes, we have to defend our embassy. So I'm not going to nitpick the president and say, oh, you shouldn't send in a certain amount of advisors. And the military decisions of protecting the embassy, to me, are very important. I've been talking a lot about Benghazi and how we didn't protect them, so I'm not going to get involved or criticize the president for trying to protect our embassy there.
So yeah, that seemed like an answer that was crafted for a 2016 presidential campaign. I'm not going to criticize President Obama for protecting our embassy because I am one who's been heavily critical of the lack of protection of our embassy in Benghazi, lack of protection from, who could that be? Oh, that's right, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And near the end of the show, I'm going to show a clip where Rand Paul explicitly attacks Hillary Clinton's performance on Benghazi and even says it disqualifies her from being president. So I think this really is some talking points he's developed for the 2016 presidential campaign. But I also want to show a clip from Rand Paul over on CNN State of the Union where he gives a more open-ended answer about what his policy for the Middle East would look like. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
Iraq, as it is now, what would President Paul do?
I think we have to understand first how we got here, and then we have to decide as a country where we're going. I think there's chaos in the Middle East, and I think the chaos is because we've created a vacuum. Before the Iraq War, I think there was somewhat of a standoff between Sunni and Shiite, had been for maybe 1,000 years off and on. But now we have a chaotic situation, we have a vacuum. And I think one of the reasons why ISIS has been emboldened is because we've been arming their allies. We have been allied with ISIS in Syria. They have had a safe haven because we have been arming the rebels to keep Assad away from them, and now they go back and forth. So I think our intervention in Syria has led precisely to what's going on.
So yeah, that was Rand Paul over on CNN State of the Union talking to Candy Crowley about his general Mideast policy. And I mentioned that I was going to backtrack and show a clip of Rand Paul's interview on NBC's Meet the Press, where he talked about the national security interest in Iraq and specifically, you know, whether it's worth dying to take Mosul when the people of Mosul aren't willing to die for Mosul. And I'll discuss that a little more after I show that clip here.
But before you get to that, ISIS as a terrorist organization has been billed by many as a clear and present danger to the United States, as a terrorist actor. Do you see that?
I look at it on a personal basis. I ask, do I want to send one of my sons or your son to fight to regain Mosul? And I think, well, yeah, these are nasty terrorists. Shouldn't we want to kill them? But I think, who should want to stop them more? Maybe the people who live there. Should not the Shiites, the Maliki government, should they not stand up? And if they're ripping their uniforms off and fleeing, if they don't think Mosul's worth saving, how am I going to convince my son or your son to die for Mosul? I know they're bad terrorists, and yes, we should prevent them from exporting terror, but I'm not so sure where the clear-cut American interest is.
Well,
now that is an argument you'd expect from someone on the left wing of the Democratic Party more than the left wing of the Republican Party, maybe. And it certainly sounds like an argument that would be to the left of Hillary Clinton if there were actually a presidential matchup between Rand Paul and Hillary Clinton, and this kind of issue. We're still, you know, in 2016, who knows what the issue foreign policy wise is going to be. A lot of things could happen between now and then, but this issue about ISIS, or some people call it ISIL, that it was been called both on the Sunday morning shows the last couple of weeks. ISIL is the Islamic state in Iraq and Syria, and then that's ISIS, and then ISIL is Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, and the Levant includes Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, and you know, that whole area there. So is a little bit more menacing. And speaking of whether ISIS is menacing or not, there seemed to be a campaign not just from some of the politicians, but even from some of the journalists as to whether ISIS was the number one or possibly the number one threat to the United States homeland. One of the interesting things, in a minute I'm going to show the Republican head of Homeland Security Committee in the House of Representatives, Michael McCaul, over on NBC's Meet the Press, say it is the number one threat to the U.S. homeland, and claim that the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is an Obama administration official, agrees that ISIS is the number one threat to the U.S. homeland. But one of the interesting things about the quote from Representative Michael McCaul is that it had this lead-in where both David Gregory, in his handoff to NBC reporter Andrea Mitchell, who I respect as a really good reporter with a lot of good sources. In his handoff, he says it's like perhaps the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland, and then Andrea Mitchell, you'll see by the end of her report, which really hypes the threat from ISIS, also says maybe the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland. And I don't know if they're getting like background from people like Michael McCaul or from the Secretary of Homeland Security. His name is Jay Johnson, although Jay is spelled like J-E-H. I showed a clip from him a couple weeks back. But anyway, first I want to show, here's the hyping of the threat of ISIS, where both NBC's David Gregory and NBC's Andrea Mitchell both say it's perhaps the biggest threat to the U.S. homeland, in a news piece on NBC's Meet the Press this morning, over in this clip.
Want to get the very latest on the extremist group ISIS and how, in just a short time, they have come to be perhaps the biggest terror threat to face the United States. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, has more.
Iraq is being pushed to the breaking point by ISIS. The radical insurgents fighting in Syria and now surging through Iraq.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
So extreme, even Al-Qaeda rejected ISIS for its murderous tactics. It is brutal, well organized, some 10,000 Sunni militants operating more like an army than ragtag insurgents. Looting banks, seizing oil fields and selling the oil, executing anyone who gets in their way.
It also poses a great danger potentially to Europe and ultimately the United States.
Their goal, form a hard-line Islamic State from Syria to Iraq and beyond. Their progress so far, nothing short of terrifying.
What they've done in Iraq, what they've done in Syria, and what they've looked to do in the West means that they are certainly the best funded, one of the most organized, and one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the world today.
ISIS fundraising looks more like a corporation than a terror group. Just look at their last annual report. Glossy, highly produced, measuring performance by listing nearly 8,000 attacks in Iraq, 1,000 assassinations, 4,000 roadside bombs, an elaborate pitch to raise money from foreign backers, principally in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait.
And it absolutely has capacity and wherewithal to maximize its presence in social media using techniques that many have said would be the envy of corporations.
ISIS also raises tens of millions of dollars through smuggling, extortion, and kidnapping for ransom.
Answer the call of Allah and
most alarming, this just released video, which NBC News cannot independently confirm. A sophisticated propaganda offensive, even using English to attract Western recruits, including Americans who could travel more easily to Europe and the U.S. Potentially one of the most significant terror threats now facing the homeland. For Meet the Press, Andrea Mitchell, NBC News.
So yeah, you can see there Andrea Mitchell saying potentially the biggest threat to the U.S. homeland, and David Gregory said that on the lead-in. And one of the other things I enjoyed about that 2-minute or so story was in 2 different places they talked about how ISIS is particularly dangerous because it's so much like a corporation. That was, I thought, a little bit amusing from the corporate media, but this idea that ISIS is a big threat. I also mentioned the next clip I'm going to show is the chairman of the House Committee, the House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security, a Republican, since it's a Republican-led House. His name is Michael McCaul, and he says it's that ISIS is the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland, and claims that the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is a department in the Obama administration, that guy also thinks that it's the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland, as you can see over in this clip.
An awful ideology, rich, well-resourced, hardened fighters, worse in the estimation of most experts than Al-Qaeda was before the 9/11 attacks.
Well, they're so extreme that Al-Qaeda, core Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri has denounced them for their tactics. I would say the vacuum, the training ground, that the state that they're creating in Syria and now Iraq is far surpassing what we saw before 9/11 in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
So spell that out for, what do you fear about their movement and their ability and their desire? What are their ultimate desires with regard to the United States?
Well, I think right now they're focused on establishing the Islamic State in the region. But I think after that is the external operations against the West and the United States. It is the #1 threat to the homeland. The Secretary of Homeland Security agrees with me in that assessment. And why is that? Because you're having foreign fighters pour all over the world into this region with legal travel documents, 100 Americans, many Europeans, people from Australia. This is a major threat to not only the region in Iraq, but also to the security of the American people on American soil.
So, Michelle.
So, yeah, that's the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee saying that ISIS, this group taking over parts of Iraq, is the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland, and also claiming that the Secretary of Homeland Security, I guess Jay Johnson from the Obama administration, agrees with him. And the reason that is kind of surprising is that President Barack Obama himself gave a couple of interviews. I'm not going to show, there was a clip from NBC's Meet the Press that I cut out, but here I'm going to show a clip of him on CBS's Face of the Nation, I'm pretty sure it was, talking, and I wish I almost wish I'd shown the NBC clip, because it was a clip that was going to show on NBC, the MSNBC show Morning Joe, and the interviewer was Mika Brzezinski, who is not my favorite journalist. I did a Woody Allen interview, Woody Allen video criticizing her, but I'm not going to show that clip. But here is a clip of President Barack Obama saying ISIS isn't the #1 threat to the U.S. homeland. So you would think the Secretary of Homeland Security, who works for him, would also have the same position on whether ISIS was the #1 threat, and that is from CBS's Face of the Nation this morning over here.
So extreme. It has been disavowed by Al-Qaeda as being too violent. Right. How urgent of a threat to the American people is ISIS?
I think it's fair to say that their extreme ideology poses a medium and long-term threat. There are a lot of groups out there that probably have more advanced immediate plans directed against the United States that we have to be on constant guard for. The thing about an organization like this is that typically when they control territory, because they're so violent, because they're so extreme, over time the local populations reject them. We've seen that time and time again. We saw it during the Iraq War in places like Anbar province, where Sunni tribes suddenly turned against them because of their extreme ideology. We're going to have to be vigilant generally. Right now, the problem with ISIS is the fact that they are destabilizing a country that could spill over into some of our allies like Jordan, and that they are engaged in wars in Syria, where in that vacuum that's been created, they could amass more arms, more resources. But I think it's important for us to recognize that ISIS is just one of a number of organizations that we have to stay focused on. Al-Qaeda in Yemen is still very active, and we're staying focused on that. In North Africa, you're seeing organizations, including Boko Haram, that kidnapped all those young women, that is extreme and violent. And this is going to be a global challenge, and one that the United States is going to have to address, but we're not going to be able to address it alone. And as I said yesterday, what we can't do is think that we're just going to play whack-a-mole and send U.S. troops occupying various countries wherever these organizations pop up. We're going to have a more focused, more targeted strategy, and we're going to have to partner and train local law enforcement and military to do their jobs as well.
Now, I think that's actually a more balanced assessment of the threat posed by this ISIS group than the hyping I showed over on NBC's Meet the Press, both from David Gregory, Andrea Mitchell, Republican Michael McCaul, and what Michael McCaul claims the guy who works for Barack Obama told him, which doesn't really make sense, that the Secretary of Homeland Security who works for Barack Obama would say that ISIS is more of a threat than Barack Obama is saying, because they're supposed to have the same message. I don't know what that's about, but I want to show Dianne Feinstein, who represents more of the right wing of the Democratic Party, And she didn't disagree with President Obama that much. She didn't go as far as like Michael McCaul. She some of the things she said that ISIS can be a threat, and then by the end of her statement, she said that there will be plots. I noticed before I started the show, someone had actually posted that in the comment section, so I guess someone was already watching the shows who was coming to watch me do my commentary, which I guess that shows that maybe I'm adding something by someone wanting to watch my commentary after having watched the shows themselves. But here's Dianne Feinstein saying that ISIS can be a threat, and then later there will be plots. Over on CNN's this is ABC's. Hold on, I can't remember whether this was CNN or ABC. Oh, it's a CNN State of the Union, I think, with Candy Crowley in this clip.
Is the ISIS an immediate threat to U.S. homeland security?
Well, I believe it can be. I believe that the recruiting in Europe, there's no question in these three places, Spain, Germany, the number of passport fighters. We know there are at least 100 Americans that have gone to the arena to fight who have an American passport, who are going to try to get back. We know that they can go back to their European country, and if it's a visa waiver country, come right into the United States. So this is where I think we need to build our intelligence to see that we can disrupt a plot in this country before it happens, because there will be plots to kill Americans.
I mean, I guess that last statement is probably true. That there will be, it's kind of vague, so there will be plots to kill Americans. I mean, you don't even have to go to foreign terrorists. I mean, there are a whole bunch of murders committed after conspiracies in the United States every year. That's plots to kill Americans, right? But it's just kind of a funny kind of phrasing there from Dianne Feinstein, who represents sort of the right wing of the Democratic Party. Did I say right wing of the Republican? I hope I didn't say that wrong again earlier. But I think it's kind of funny that I got to show Barbara Boxer, my senator here from California, representing the left wing of the Democratic Party, and then Dianne Feinstein, also my senator from California, representing the right wing of the Democratic Party. And the statement there from President Obama about ISIS not being that as big a threat as some people say was criticized by someone on the right wing of the Republican Party, Representative Mike Rogers, who is chair of the House Intelligence Committee and is very pro-intervention in Islamic countries, I guess, and especially pro-NSA spying. He's a former FBI agent, so he's especially a big advocate for NSA spying. But here he is saying that President Obama's downplaying of the threat from ISIS is wrong in an interview over on Face the Nation with Norah O'Donnell in this clip.
Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, I want to get your reaction to what the president said to me when I asked him about how big of a threat is ISIS to America's national security. He said it's a medium and long-term threat, and that we can't just play whack-a-mole with all these different terrorist groups that are popping up.
Well, listen, unfortunately, it's easy to try to diminish the threat. What we know happens, as we watched happen in Afghanistan, they build safe haven, they train, they recruit, they plan operations that led to 9/11, the killing of 3,000 Americans. They have already expressed, this is what got them in trouble with Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda and the replacement for Osama bin Laden, is not only were they brutal, but they were talking about taking people with Western passports and sending them back home for terrorist operations from eastern Syria. That's what got Zawahiri all worked up over this group. And they weren't taking direction very well from Zawahiri. Not that their goals were any different. So here you have a group, now think of this, $1 billion in cash and bullion, well armed, well financed. They have lots of free space in which to operate, train, and we know that they have intentions to send people who have shown up with Western passports back to the United States and back to Europe. That is as dangerous as it gets. Now, is it 6 months, 3 months, or a year? We're not sure, but I wouldn't wait. And it's not whack-a-mole. This is in our national security interest. Bumper sticker phrases aren't going to win this thing. We've got to be dug in for the long haul because they're dug in for the long haul.
You know, one of the things I noticed, that those are the clips I'm going to show on how big a threat ISIS is to the United States. There's sort of a range of opinion there from like number one threat to one of many threats. But one of the things I noticed watching those last two clips for I think like the third time now back to back is that even though Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, didn't agree in his conclusions with Democratic chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein, they used a lot of the same phrases and talking points to support their arguments, which makes me think that they're getting a lot of briefings from the same people, which would make a lot of sense because they chair intelligence committees in two respective bodies of Congress. But I just kind of noticed that the last time I watched that there. And the other issue that Mike Rogers brought up, and then I'm going to show Barbara Boxer sort of giving an opposing view on it, is whether the problem that's occurring here in Iraq is the blame or the result of Barack Obama's policy in Syria. Mike Rogers, obviously the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, comes out saying that it is President Obama's fault for not acting in Syria, and you'll hear sort of this opposite argument from Barbara Boxer in a minute. But here's Mike Rogers again on Face the Nation talking to Norah O'Donnell in this clip.
It was a policy failure because, remember, not taking action is a decision. And many of us who were calling for a more robust engagement in Syria, and again, this isn't the 101st Airborne Division, it's not troops on the ground. We have lots of other options. And our argument at the time was if we don't do something to disrupt their growth in eastern Syria, we are going to be in serious trouble. We watch them grow, then we watch them launch an attack from eastern Syria, a safe haven, into Iraq. That's why this has been so concerning. People say, oh, intelligence wasn't there. Intelligence was there. We didn't do anything in Syria. We didn't do anything when they took Fallujah. We didn't do anything when they took Mosul. They got into Tikrit and somebody said, hey, this is a problem. Well, no kidding.
All right. Chairman.
So yeah, that's Representative Mike Rogers, the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, blaming Barack Obama for not doing enough in Syria and causing these problems in Iraq, since a lot of the people came over from the Syria conflict. You know, ISIS is a group that goes across that border. But you want to hear the opposite opinion from Barbara Boxer, Democratic senator from California, also over on CBS's Face the Nation, talking to Norah O'Donnell over in this clip.
Argue that the president essentially has helped ISIS by omission, that by not acting in Syria, that ISIS was strong enough then to cross the border into Iraq, and this is the result.
Well, it's the opposite. The hawks were saying, arm Syria, arm Syria. The president knew that ISIS was in Syria and didn't want them to get control of the weapons. So that's just completely false. And I will say, the big surprise I think the president would admit to, and I think is a fact, is the Iraqi army that we spent $23 billion training just melted away in the face of just hundreds of ISIS. So we have a national security interest here. I agree with Senator Rubio, and I agree with, absolutely, and the President of the United States. No combat counterterrorism mission is critical to us. And therefore, as long as those advisors are not in harm's way, and they are not in harm's way, they can assess the situation and we can conduct counterterrorism. That's the key. Look, Norah, the Iraqi people had a chance of a lifetime. I didn't vote to send those for that war. It's one of my proudest moments. Only 23 of us in the United States Senate, because it was based on false pretense. And we unleashed a horror that we're seeing today. But the bottom line is we do have a counterterrorism mission, and I support that mission.
So I guess if we're not going to listen to people who are wrong in Iraq, then we need to listen to the people who are right on Iraq. And I don't know what Mike Rogers' position, I should have looked that up, but Barbara Boxer points out that she was one of the people who voted against the war in Iraq. So and the left wing of the Republican Party, I guess even Glenn Beck, I don't have a clip for that, but Glenn Beck came out and said, the left wing was right about Iraq, we should have listened to them, and I'm sorry. That was kind of one of the surprises about the split in the Republican Party, or the conservatives or the right wing this week. But I also want to show a surprising place where President Barack Obama's Syria policy got a little boost on the Sunday morning shows. There was an exclusive interview on Meet the Press. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave an interview, and he wasn't very happy about what was going on in Iraq because he's worried about Iran, and I'll show a clip on that in a minute. But first, here he is saying that what should happen with Iran is what happened with Syria, and saying something good happened with Syria, though not totally. But anyway, here is Bibi Netanyahu on NBC's Meet the Press this morning here.
I'll tell you what a good deal is. A good deal is actually what was negotiated by the United States and President Obama in the case of the chemical weapons in Syria. You haven't solved the problem in Syria between Sunnis and Shiites, but you did remove the bulk of the weapons and soon all of the weapons and the stockpiles. You removed them. What is, I think, being discussed in the case of Iran by the international community is that you remove most of the sanctions and Iran gets to keep most of the capabilities, most of the stockpiles, most of the ability to manufacture the means to make nuclear weapons. That's a terrible mistake. I hope it doesn't come to pass because I think this would change history. It would be a monumental mistake in the context of the world at large and the Middle East as it is today. This would be a tragic, tragic outcome.
And if you think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was very focused on Iran getting nuclear weapons, you can see in that same interview when David Gregory asked him if this conflict in Iraq is strengthening Iran, his answer said was also Iran can't get nuclear weapons. And I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
Let me pick up on the reporting from Chuck Todd and hearing the president's comments, his cautious approach to intervening in Iraq. Do you fear that that could strengthen Iran?
Look, I think it's a complicated situation and there are no easy answers, but what you're seeing in the Middle East today, in Iraq and in Syria, is the stark hatreds between radical Shiites, in this case led by Iran, and radical Sunnis led by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others. Now, both of these camps are enemies of the United States. And when your enemies are fighting each other, don't strengthen either one of them, weaken both. And I think by far the worst outcome that could come out of this is that one of these factions, Iran, would come out with nuclear weapons capability. That would be a tragic mistake. It would make everything else pale in comparison. I think the ultimate and the most important goal in the Middle East is to make sure Iran does not have nuclear weapons capability.
To that
because
point,
those weapons, unlike mortars and machine guns that can kill thousands and chemical weapons that kill tens of thousands, these weapons, nuclear weapons, could kill millions. That should be prevented at all costs.
You're well.
So yeah, it sounds like. Oh, sorry about that. I was just cooling off my computer while the clip was playing by putting a cold pack under it because it gets overheated. That's what that little bump in the video was about. Sorry, I apologize for that. But so far the show's been going pretty well, technically otherwise, compared to some recent shows, including last week's, which I'm sorry about. But speaking of, or finishing up with the topic of Iraq, I showed the two clips there from Benjamin Netanyahu and his fear about this Iran's power growing from the Iraq conflict and, of course, getting a nuclear weapon. I normally try to show just newsmakers and not pundits, although I do show a few reporters. And David Ignatius, who's kind of a pundit and a reporter over on CBS's was over on CBS's Face the Nation, and he actually reported something I hadn't heard anywhere else about Iran and Iraq, and whether there's actually a split between Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, who is Shia, and the people in Iran, also a Shia power, who are kind of supporting that. That's why we may end up on the side of Iran in this conflict, as I discussed last week. But anyway, David Ignatius was talking about how there may actually be a split between Iran and al-Maliki, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip from CBS's Face the Nation here.
Well, I think in truth, Norah, he's hoping that Iran will do this for the United States, that Iran will do the dirty work. There's some signs that the Iranians have gotten fed up with Maliki. I have a report out of Baghdad I can't confirm that says that Friday, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the most powerful person in Iraq, met with Maliki and dressed him down in front of his staff in a humiliating way, which people in Baghdad who were reporting to me said was a sign that the Iranians want Maliki out. Another sign is the sudden surge of the Mahdi army, which has strong connections to Tehran, which is in the streets. You know, that's as much an anti-Maliki force as anything else.
So yeah, that was a point that I didn't hear anyone else make. Of course, he said it was an unconfirmed report, so I guess we should take that with a grain of salt. And one other thing that we should take with a grain of salt, I guess, is I showed all those clips of people talking about the terrorist forces in Iraq and people who are fighting in a civil war without, really thinking about what it means to be a terrorist. And I didn't see that addressed on the Sunday morning shows, but I saw Glenn Greenwald, who I like, I'd say, well over 80% of what I hear him say, which is more than most people I see in the media, talking about how we may be misusing that terrorist label, even with some of these people we're talking about in Iraq, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
All war we support all kinds of people who are really bad people, who kill civilians, who target people who but I mean, this word terrorism is supposed to just put people into this state of irrational fear and support whatever the government is doing, and we ought to ask ourselves, what does that even mean? A lot of these people are Iraqis fighting for control of their own government. I mean, maybe there's an argument to make that outside forces that go in and start bombing that country or invading that country are actually terrorists more so than the people in the country.
Well, when I was there, I wasn't a terrorist.
That was Paul, I think his name is Rykov. I hope I have that right. I didn't even list him in the credits or the list of guests down below, but that last comment, I wasn't a terrorist, is from the leader of, I think he's the Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, or I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact name of his group, but he's a big veterans leader, and so I guess he was refuting our U.S. troops being terrorists, but I think the word terrorist is kind of overused, especially, I'm not saying that these ISIS people who were like kicked out of Al-Qaeda for being too extreme, I'm not saying that I'm defending them, but I do like that point that Glenn Greenwald made about the overuse of the word terrorist. And before I leave the whole Iraq issue, there are a couple sort of like media criticism specific points I want to make with a couple clips. First, I talked about how Mike Rogers was over on Fox News Sunday the previous week when this whole Iraq story broke about this ISIS group taking over large parts of the country, and even though he's chair of the House Intelligence Committee, no one on Fox News Sunday asked him if there was some intelligence failure that this happened, and no one really saw it coming. But Dianne Feinstein, the Democratic chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was over on CNN's State of the Union, and just to give Candy Crowley credit, I said I see her often confronting politicians with the facts. She confronted Dianne Feinstein with that particular issue, although I'm actually going to criticize Candy Crowley a little later for being too chummy with Dianne Feinstein, but here she is actually asking the question of Dianne Feinstein that Fox News never asked of Mike Rogers about whether this big rise of ISIS in Iraq represents an intelligence failure. Over in this clip.
Imagine that most Americans were surprised to learn 10 days ago or a week ago that something called the ISIS had taken over a third of Iraq. Did U.S. intelligence spot this problem? Did you know of it ahead of time? And was the severity of it obvious through the intelligence?
Well, obviously we know about ISIS. We've seen its developments in Syria. We're aware of the fact that they are recruiting fighters in Europe. There have been arrests in Spain, France, and Germany. They've tried to assassinate the head of security in Beirut, and they were responsible for the killing of 3 or 4 people at a Brussels synagogue. They are vicious. They have killed thousands of people. They have cut off heads. They are a major
brutal bunch, and
we
a major
knew they were a brutal
Did we know
bunch.
that a third of Iraq could be taken over so quickly? Did we see that coming?
I would have to say no.
So finally, at least you get a slight admission that there was kind of an intelligence failure, although in a clip I'm not going to show that was kind of disputed. But in the media criticism, I wanted to show that, first I thought I was going to show that only Fox News was the only outlet that led their broadcast with this whole Lois Lerner lost emails issue, which I think is kind of a non-issue, and I'm not going to really show any clips on it. They gave sort of a little nod to Iraq, and they didn't do any real reporting on Iraq, although it turns out ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos also talked about the Lois Lerner thing, and I'll show that in a minute. But first, here is Fox News Sunday gave like a slight nod to what's going on in Iraq, and then had like these 2 more Republican stories. Like I told you I was going to show you, they talked about the split in the Republican Party as a growth in Republican leadership, and then of course the Lois Lerner email story. Here's the intro to Fox News Sunday this morning, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show that clip here.
I'm Chris Wallace. ISIS insurgents on the march in western Iraq. We'll have the latest. And House Republicans elect new leaders and try to present a united front heading into the midterm election.
We've got solid conservative solutions that are going to solve the problems facing our country. I'll make one promise. I will work every single day to make sure this conference has the courage to lead with the wisdom to listen.
We'll sit down with Kevin McCarthy to discuss immigration, spending, and the Tea Party in his first interview since being elected House Majority Leader. It's a Fox News Sunday exclusive. Then fireworks on Capitol Hill as lawmakers grill the head of the IRS over those lost Lois Lerner emails.
What I didn't hear in that was an apology to this committee.
I don't think an apology is owed.
I don't believe you. This is incredible.
I have a long career. That's the first time anybody has said they do not believe me.
We'll talk with attorney Cleta Mitchell, who represents conservative groups in a lawsuit against the IRS. And Julian Epstein, a former top Democratic House staffer.
So yeah, on the IRS issue, they actually had like 2 newsmakers on, but they didn't really have any newsmakers on the whole Iraq issue. They asked Kevin McCarthy about it a little bit, but they let him get away with just saying that we need a strategy, and didn't really talk much about what it should be. And they didn't do any reporting from Iraq. Their reporting was from Shannon Bream at the White House, and I'll talk about that a little more after I show how Shannon Bream reported on the politics, but not really any real reporting on Iraq over on Fox News Sunday this morning here.
Fox News correspondent Shannon Bream has the latest from the White House. Shannon.
Chris, as the White House continues to mull over strategy regarding just how involved the U.S. will be in that growing conflict in Iraq, ISIS is making steady gains, continuing to move forward in areas that are critical to its advance. We're talking about key border towns along Iraq's border, primarily with Syria. Capture of those towns makes the border between the 2 countries even more porous, facilitating the movement of weapons, equipment, and fighters. There is also growing concern about the city of Haditha, which is home to a key dam across the Euphrates River. Damage to that dam could be devastating to the surrounding area, causing major flooding and potentially shutting down portions of the country's electrical grid. This morning, the Iraqi government has released video it says shows military aircraft bombing suspected militant hideouts in Mosul, which was taken by ISIS fighters about 2 weeks ago. Fox News cannot independently verify the authenticity of this video. There is still no confirmation about the details regarding up to 300 so-called military advisors the president may send into Iraq. There are still many questions about what kind of legal protections they would have. Administration officials say they are continuing to negotiate that with the current Iraqi government. As you mentioned, Secretary of State John Kerry has touched down in the region today. He's expected to make several stops there with an emphasis on encouraging Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to make it clear that his government will be more inclusive of all the competing factions within his country. Chris?
More on this with a panel a little later. Shannon.
So yeah, they talked about it more on the panel, just like Chris Wallace said there, but not much with the newsmakers, and it was all political spin. But I did, just to be fair to Fox News, I want to show the intro to ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where they did mention the Lois Lerner missing emails, but then you also see Martha Raddatz was not reporting from the White House, and she gave a media report about what's going on in Iraq, and she even, well, you'll see she was actually in Baghdad, and later in the show, in clips, later in that show, in clips I won't be showing on my show, she talked to reporters who were working in Iraq. But anyway, this is the intro to ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning here.
Starting right now on ABC's This Week. Crisis in Iraq. Hundreds of U.S. troops moving in as advisors. A jihadist army digging in. Will President Obama give the order for airstrikes? This morning, Martha Raddatz in Baghdad leading our coverage. Then, Taxman takedown.
I don't believe you.
New outrage in the IRS scandal. How did the agency lose thousands of crucial emails? And Justice Sonia Sotomayor on the future of affirmative action and that surprising Costco run-in with Hillary Clinton.
It was not planned, I can assure you. I promise.
From ABC News, This Week with George Stephanopoulos begins now.
Good morning. I'm Martha Raddatz in Baghdad, where the battle for control of Iraq has taken a dire turn. The jihadist group ISIS gaining new ground in the last 48 hours, capturing 4 key towns near the Syrian border, and now threatening not only this country, but the entire region and the U.S. homeland with its growing strength. We have team coverage.
So yeah, you can see Martha Raddatz was actually in Baghdad, but she was also saying that there was a strong threat from this ISIS group, and they did include that whole IRS scandal, which I think is kind of a non-scandal, and in several ways I've seen kind of a more rightward tilt from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and I don't know if it has to do with this, but I want to show you when they went to commercial break, they show like these picks of the week, and you have to see who was the advertiser on This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning. Was kind of telling. I don't know if it... well, you tell me if you think this may explain some of the more rightward tilt on ABC's This Week after you see going to commercial here.
Under fire. But first, the Powerhouse Roundtable's big winners of the week. Back in 2 minutes.
One of our nation's largest private companies is proudly built on American values and skill. Koch Industries started in the heartland and has expanded to nearly every state. Today, that means more than 60,000 American jobs. We're still branching out into new fields, but our vision has stayed the same, to provide innovations that help people improve their lives. You may not always see our name on the products you use, but we're working every day to help make better food, clothing, shelter, transportation.
I think you get the picture. I don't want to show the whole Koch Industries ad, but I don't know. Do you think having a sponsor of the Koch Industries, famous for the Koch brothers, right-wing Republican financiers, that may explain some of the more right-wing tilt on? I don't know. I mean, it is corporate media, so I just had to show you that. And speaking of criticizing the media, I thought there was an interesting criticism of the media from one of the guests on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos got this rare interview with Justice of the Supreme Court Sonia Sotomayor, and she talked about why she is decided to change her mind, which is always good to hear a Supreme Court justice willing to do, about whether she should read dissents from the bench and it included a media criticism that you can see over in this clip.
I have to ask you, the former governor of Montana, Brian Schweitzer, a fellow
The court
Democrat,
recently upheld a ban on racial preferences for college admissions. Sotomayor spoke out from the bench in dissent for the first time. Just a couple of months earlier, you'd said you didn't think that was a very good practice. So what changed?
Linda Greenhouse,
The Supreme Court reporter.
the Supreme Court reporter, who pointed me to an article that argued for the pros of speaking dissents from the bench.
So what was the argument that convinced you?
The argument was that it signals to the public, in a way that nothing else does, that the question is different than what the majority has thought. And I realize that in this fast-paced internet world, reporters are no longer reading about cases before they comment on them.
I mean, I guess reporters are reading about the cases. I think she meant to say they aren't reading the cases, because lawyers should always read cases before they comment on them. And I thought that was an interesting comment on the media from a justice of the Supreme Court. And another criticism I had of the media, this is the interview with Dianne Feinstein. I said I was going to show a clip of Candy Crowley getting a little too chummy with Dianne Feinstein. I mean, there were these comments that were definitely too off color, that this guy who may be running for president against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, Brian Schweitzer, who used to be governor of Colorado. Anyway, here is he made some off-color remarks about Dianne Feinstein's conflict with the CIA, whether they were looking in on her committee's computers too much after she was such a big supporter of the NSA. And here's Candy Crowley asking her about it in this clip.
I have to ask you, the former governor of Montana, Brian Schweitzer, a fellow Democrat, was discussing your role in the NSA and surveillance, et cetera, and what you knew and didn't know, but used really unflattering terms, likening you to something which I'm not going to repeat because everybody can look it up on Google. I know that you said he better not come in a room with my husband. Brian Schweitzer has apologized, but I want to know, just flat out, what was your first reaction when they told you what he said?
Well, my first reaction was that I laughed, to tell you the truth. And, you know, he's got clearly a rather large mouth, and all sorts of things come out. I think that's really too bad, but it's the way it is.
It is the way it is, and women that have been in power for a long time understand sometimes
exactly.
these sorts of things happen.
Yes.
Let me just ask you quickly, has he called you to apologize?
No.
Would that help?
No, but it says something, doesn't it?
It does. Senator Dianne.
Did you hear Candy Crowley at the end there say, it does? I think that may be a little bit too chummy, a little bit too much agreeing, although I guess it's woman power or whatever that they identify with the anti-feminist bent of that whole comment, and I can't really disagree with that part, but it just seemed a little unjournalistic to me, and so I wanted to point that out. I also want to, that was the NSA spying clip I'm going to show for the show, if you're wondering what topic that was under. That was actually the NSA spying topic. I have 3 more quick clips before I end the show. 2 of them on presidential politics for 2016. First, I want to show a clip of Rand Paul being interviewed by David Gregory on Meet the Press, showing his talking points against Hillary Clinton on Benghazi. I think I promised this earlier, and now I'm delivering it, as you can see in this clip.
She'll be made to pay for Benghazi. How?
She will have to explain how she can be commander-in-chief when she was not responsive to multiple requests for more security in the 6 months leading up. Plus, there were a lot of expenditures at the State Department under her watch. $650,000 was spent on Facebook ads when they didn't have enough money for security. $5 million was spent on crystal glassware that summer. So there's a lot of expenditures that she approved, but she wouldn't approve a 16-person personnel team, and she wouldn't approve an airplane to help them get around the country. In the last 24 hours, a plane was very important and it wasn't available. These are really serious questions beyond talking points that occurred under her watch.
Benghazi is disqualifying for her?
I think so. I don't think the American people want a commander-in-chief that will send reinforcements, that will defend the country, and that will provide the adequate security. And I think in the moment of need, a long moment, a 6-month moment, she wasn't there.
So yeah, that's Senator Rand Paul gearing up for his presidential run, saying that Hillary Clinton is disqualified from being president because of her actions on Benghazi. And of course, I don't really agree with that, but he also said something I really do agree with, and this is part of, he's been doing a lot of things to reach out to non-traditional Republican constituencies, and one of the constituencies he's reaching out to has to do with the issue of felony disenfranchisement, which I really agree with him on, and he also talked about that in his interview with David Gregory, as you can see over in this clip.
Something you said last year. If I told you that 1 out of 3 African-American males is forbidden by law from voting, you might think I was talking about Jim Crow 50 years ago. Yet today, 1/3 of African-American males are still prevented from voting because of the war on drugs. What do you mean, and what do you want to do about it?
It's the biggest voting rights issue of our day. We've gotten distracted by a lot of other things. We think there may be 1 million people who are prevented from voting from having a previous felony conviction. I'll give you an example. I have a friend whose brother 30 years ago grew marijuana plants in college. He made a mistake. He probably would tell you now it's a mistake. He still can't vote, and every time he goes to get a job, he has to check a box that says convicted felon. It prevents you from employment. So if we're the party of family values and keeping families together, and a party that believes in redemption and second chances, we should be for letting people have the right to vote back. And I think the face of the Republican Party needs to be not about suppressing vote, but about enhancing the vote. So I have a bill that I'm going to introduce next week, if it comes forward, would allow somewhere between 500,000 people to 1 million people to get the right to vote back.
And
so that is kind of surprising, or maybe it's not surprising, but I'm glad to see Rand Paul on that side of the issue. That's certainly the side of the issue I agree with, and I think it's an interesting tactic for running for president. I don't think he's going to be successful, but he did try to sort of thread the needle on the immigration issue, and that's the final clip I want to show from his interview with David Gregory, where he isn't for a path to citizenship, but possibly a path to legalization, which means more work visas and, of course, strengthen the border. And that'll be the final clip for the show that I want you to see right here.
Here's Rupert Murdoch, the executive chairman of News Corp, runs Fox News, among other properties, and he writes this week: "We need to give those individuals who are already here, after they've passed checks to ensure they are not dangerous criminals, a path to citizenship so they can pay their full taxes, be counted, and become more productive members of our community." Is this call, which is basically what others would call amnesty, something that the party needs to rethink its opposition to?
I think that everyone needs to be for some form of immigration reform because the status quo is untenable. So I consider myself a bridge to the conservative community because I am about as conservative as they come, maybe a little libertarian too. But I think that if we do nothing, 11 million more people may be coming illegally. So we have to do something. But here's the conundrum, and I think the conundrum has really been pointed out by the children being dumped on the border right now. There's a humanitarian disaster of 50,000 kids being dumped on this side of our border. It's because you have a beacon, forgiveness, and you don't have a secure border. So that's why conservatives who are for immigration reform, I am for immigration reform, but I insist that you secure the border first, because if you have a beacon of some kind of forgiveness without a secure border, the whole world
is a
will
pathway to citizenship amnesty in your book?
I think that's the whole point. That's the whole problem of this, is what is amnesty? Because I'll give you an example. The platform in one state that I was in recently says no deportation and no amnesty. Well, if you're not going to deport people, you are somehow changing the current law, because the current law says everybody must go.
But you've said the party should give up this word amnesty.
I think we need to get beyond it, but we also need to get beyond the status quo, because the status quo is not acceptable. So I am for pushing and trying to say to my conservatives across the country, we need some form of immigration reform, border security first, but then we should have something that allows people who want to work in our country, who are here. I say we will find a place for you if you want to work, and we link it to work, because as Republicans...
And a path to citizenship?
Well, the path to citizenship is the longer, is a more difficult goal.
But you don't rule it out as an end game.
What I would say is at this point in time, I don't think any immigration reform will get out of Washington that includes a path to citizenship, but I do think that there is a path to a secure border and an expanded work visa program.
You are...
So yeah, that's it. That's the final clip. Expanded work visas and a secure border. Final clip from Rand Paul. I thought that was really interesting. I hope you thought it was interesting, the clips I picked out. There were so many. I'm over an hour and a half. I really have to end the show. I appreciate the 100 of you or so who showed up as a live show. I have been reading your comments along the way, and it's kind of hard to... I saw you were talking about solar roadways and the Fallout video game, and so I do appreciate it. Someone asked who my... I saw Pat's 4 Rules said who my ideal presidential candidate was, and I don't know, I can't really give that on the fly. And like I said, it's we're well over an hour and a half. This show shouldn't really be much more over an hour. I may actually try to have a much more abbreviated show next week. We'll see, but I do appreciate all of you who showed up. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I was reading your comments along the way, and I will be back next week at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. For those of you in North America, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. For those of you in Europe and New Zealand and Australia and Africa and around the world where it's already the beginning of the week, I hope you're enjoying the beginning of your summer, and I'll be picking out the best clips that I can find from the corporate media here in the United States every Sunday at 6:30 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you enjoyed my selection and my commentary, and I'll be seeing you all around the internet.